The dust of Fort Riley, Kansas, clung to everything in the summer of 1944. It coated the barracks, settled on the parade ground, and seemed to lodge in the throats of the soldiers stationed there. Among them was Sergeant Eleanor Vance, a woman whose presence in uniform still raised more than a few eyebrows, even 2 years after Pearl Harbor. Eleanor wasn't just a soldier. She was a woman in a man's world, holding a rank that many believed she hadn't truly earned, not in the same way a man would. She was in her early 30s, with sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing and a posture that spoke of an unyielding inner core, though it was often mistaken for stiffness. Her hair, the color of rich earth, was always pulled back in a neat bun, practical and no nonsense, just like Eleanor herself. Her journey to Fort Riley hadn't been a straightforward one. Growing up in a small, tight-knit farming community in Iowa, Eleanor had been taught the value of hard work and self-reliance from a young age. Her father, a man of few words but immense integrity, had instilled in her a quiet strength. When the war broke out, a fierce patriotism ignited within her, a desire to contribute, to protect. She didn't want to be relegated to typist pools or nursing. She wanted to be on the front lines of logistics, where decisions were made, where things moved. She'd fought tooth and nail, proving her mettle in various training programs, often outperforming men who scoffed at her ambition. Her intelligence and organizational skills were undeniable, and eventually, she'd been assigned to the prisoner of war, POW, camp administration at Fort Riley. Fort Riley was a buzzing hub, a vital training ground, and now, a temporary home for hundreds of German POWs captured during the North African Campaign and the early days of fighting in Europe. These men, far from their homes, were a mixture of hardened soldiers and young, bewildered conscripts. Eleanor's role was crucial, managing the logistics of their internment, ensuring regulations were followed, and overseeing the camp's daily operations. It was a job that required precision, firmness, and an unwavering adherence to the Geneva Conventions. However, her competence was often overshadowed by the pervasive skepticism of her male colleagues. Captain Thomas Miller, a man in his late 40s with a perpetually furrowed brow and a booming voice, was her immediate superior. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man who believed implicitly in the old ways, in the natural order of things, which, in his mind, placed women firmly in the domestic sphere. He saw Eleanor not as a capable sergeant, but as an anomaly, a sign of wartime desperation. He made no secret of his disdain, often making thinly veiled remarks about women's delicate sensibilities or emotional decisions in her presence, knowing full well they were directed at her. "Sergeant Vance!" he'd barked one sweltering morning, sweat beading on his upper lip as he inspected a shipment manifest Eleanor had painstakingly prepared. "Are you quite certain these figures are correct? We can't have any errors when dealing with security protocols." The emphasis on errors was deliberate, a subtle jab at her supposed unreliability. Eleanor, standing at attention, met his gaze calmly. "Yes, sir, Captain. I've cross-referenced them twice. The inventory matches the requisition form, and the transfers are accounted for." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the frustration that churned within her. She knew her work was flawless. She always ensured it was. She had to be twice as good, twice as diligent, just to be considered half as credible. Another officer, Lieutenant Barnes, younger and less outwardly hostile but equally dismissive, often snickered or exchanged knowing glances with other men when Eleanor issued orders or offered a strategic suggestion during a briefing. "Looks like Sergeant Vance is trying to run the whole show," he'd once mumbled, loud enough for others to hear, implying she was overstepping her bounds. The words stung, but Eleanor had learned to build a wall around her emotions, to let the slights glance off her. She knew that reacting would only give them more ammunition. Her quiet strength, however, was often misinterpreted as coldness or a lack of passion. They didn't see the long hours she put in, the meticulous planning, the genuine concern she held for the smooth operation of the camp, which, ultimately, contributed to the war effort. They didn't see the weight of expectation she carried, not just for herself, but for all women serving in uniform. If she failed, it wouldn't just be Eleanor Vance failing. It would be a woman failing. One particularly grueling afternoon, a new contingent of POWs arrived. They were younger than previous groups, many barely out of their teens, their faces etched with the fatigue and fear of battle. As Eleanor oversaw their processing, ensuring they were registered and properly segregated according to rank and potential security risk, Captain Miller approached her, a smirk playing on his lips. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you'd prefer to supervise the laundry detail? I hear the linens need a woman's touch." His words were met with chuckles from a few nearby guards. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She took a deep breath, counting to 3 in her mind. "With all due respect, Captain," she replied, her voice low but firm, "my duties are here, ensuring the efficient intake of these prisoners, and I assure you my touch is more than adequate for the task at hand." She turned back to her clipboard, effectively dismissing him, an act that clearly surprised Miller, leaving him momentarily speechless before he stalked off, grumbling. That evening, alone in her sparse barrack room, the day's indignities weighed heavily. She pulled out a letter from her younger sister Mary back home in Iowa. Mary's letters were a lifeline, filled with news of the farm, family gossip, and innocent questions about Eleanor's life in the Army. "Are you enjoying yourself, Ellie?" Mary had written. "Mother says you're doing important work." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Important work, yes. Enjoying herself?" That was a more complicated question. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. There were faint lines around her eyes, etched there by stress and sleepless nights. She saw the unwavering resolve, the quiet defiance that pulsed beneath her composed exterior. She knew she was good at her job. She knew she was contributing. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not let their mockery break her. She would continue to do her duty with precision and integrity no matter how many times she was underestimated. Because the war was bigger than their petty prejudices, and Eleanor Vance was determined to play her part, no matter the cost to her own spirit. The dust of Fort Riley was heavy, but so was her resolve. This was just the beginning of her fight. Not just against the Axis powers, but against the entrenched biases within her own ranks. The days at Fort Riley blurred into a monotonous rhythm of reports, inspections, and the constant hum of military life. For Eleanor, each sunrise brought a renewed determination to prove her worth, not with grand gestures, but with consistent, meticulous work. She oversaw the distribution of supplies, ensuring the POWs received their allotted rations and clothing according to international law. She managed work details, dispatching groups of prisoners to local farms or maintenance projects, always under strict guard. It was demanding, thankless work, often overshadowed by the condescending remarks of Captain Miller and Lieutenant Barnes. Yet, Eleanor found a strange solace in the routine. It allowed her to focus, to channel her energy away from the personal slights and into the larger purpose. She saw the POWs not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, albeit adversaries, who were now under her care. She maintained a professional distance, of course, but her inherent sense of fairness meant she insisted on proper treatment, even when some of the American guards felt less inclined to extend courtesies to the men who had recently been trying to kill their countrymen. One afternoon, a new shipment of provisions arrived, including a surprising quantity of luxury items meant for the American troops, but accidentally routed to the POW camp's commissary. Among these were several crates of Coca-Cola bottles and tubs of prepackaged ice cream, a rare treat in wartime, especially for those not on the front lines. Eleanor immediately flagged the discrepancy. These items were clearly not for the prisoners. "Sergeant Vance, what's the fuss?" Captain Miller grumbled, arriving on the scene, drawn by the unusual activity around the supply tent. He looked at the crates, then at Eleanor, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "Sir, these items were misdelivered. They're not on the POW manifest. They're clearly meant for our own personnel," Eleanor explained, pointing to the labels. Miller squinted at the crates. "Coca-Cola, eh? And ice cream. Well, I'll be. A little taste of home for our boys." He scratched his chin. "No harm in a few of these making their way into the officers' mess, is there, Sergeant?" I'm sure a few bottles won't be missed. His implication was clear. Skim a little off the top for themselves. Eleanor's spine stiffened. Sir, with all due respect, these are government supplies. They need to be accounted for and rerouted immediately. Any diversion would be a breach of protocol and frankly unethical. Her words were polite, but her tone left no room for argument. She knew that temptation during wartime could lead to corruption, and she wasn't about to stand by and let it happen under her watch. Miller's face darkened. Unethical, Sergeant. You question my ethics? I've been fighting wars since before you were a twinkle in your daddy's eye. I know what's ethical in wartime. He glared at her, his authority challenged by a woman once again. Just make sure they're locked up. I'll decide where they go. Later that week, a particularly hot and dusty day, a group of young German prisoners was brought in from a labor detail, their faces grimy, their uniforms sweat-soaked. They'd been clearing brush in the blistering Kansas sun. As they lined up for their evening meal, Eleanor noticed their exhaustion, their quiet dejection. They were just boys, really, stripped of their uniforms' intimidating power, looking utterly vulnerable. That evening, as Eleanor finished her shift, a thought sparked in her mind. She remembered the crates of Coca-Cola and ice cream. They were still locked in the supply tent, awaiting rerouting. Miller hadn't issued any specific orders for them, apparently forgetting in the press of other duties. A small rebellious idea began to form. It wasn't about defiance for defiance's sake, but about a deeper human connection, a small gesture of recognition for their shared humanity, even across enemy lines. She also knew it would be a subtle way to demonstrate that not all Americans were as harsh or opportunistic as Miller. She sought out the camp's medical officer, Major Thompson, a kind-faced man who, unlike Miller, treated Eleanor with respect. Major, these prisoners returning from the fields, they're showing signs of heat exhaustion. I'm concerned about their morale, too. Major Thompson nodded, his brow furrowed. Yes, Sergeant. It's tough work out there. A little something cool might help. Maybe some extra water. What if we offered them something? More? Eleanor suggested carefully. We have those misdelivered provisions, the Coca-Cola and ice cream. They're locked up, designated for rerouting. But a small portion, as a medical morale booster, it would be logged as such, of course. Thompson raised an eyebrow, a thoughtful expression on his face. He knew Miller wouldn't approve, but he also recognized the practical benefits. Happy prisoners were less troublesome prisoners. It's unorthodox, Sergeant, he mused. But a little sugar might do them good. And it is hot. He paused, considering. All right, Vance, let's make it a humanitarian gesture. A small amount, strictly supervised. And make sure it's properly documented. I'll sign off on the medical requisition. Eleanor felt a surge of quiet triumph. It wasn't just about the soda and ice cream. It was about asserting her judgment, about doing what she believed was right, even against the unspoken resistance. The next day, under the blazing sun, a small detail of guards, led by Eleanor and overseen by Major Thompson, distributed the unexpected treats. The German prisoners, lining up for their usual meager lunch, watched with curiosity as crates were opened. They had no idea what these peculiar bottles and tubs were. Their guards had only ever given them water, coffee, and basic rations. Eleanor, maintaining her composed demeanor, instructed a translator to explain. These are a small gesture of refreshment, the translator announced in German. A cold drink and a sweet treat from the American Red Cross. She purposefully omitted the misdelivered part, letting the humanitarian aspect take center stage. The first prisoner to receive a bottle of Coca-Cola looked at it with a mixture of suspicion and wonder. He held the cold, condensation-covered bottle in his hands, examining the strange red label. He uncapped it hesitantly, and a fizzing sound startled him. He took a tentative sip, his eyes widening. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unadulterated expression of surprise and delight. He looked at his comrades, then back at Eleanor, a silent moment of unexpected connection. Then came the ice cream. Most of these young men had never seen ice cream before, certainly not like this. They peered into the tubs, bewildered by the creamy, frozen substance. Some tried to eat it with their fingers, unsure how to manage the foreign delicacy. Eleanor, watching from a slight distance, saw a young man, no older than 18, take a spoonful. His eyes closed for a moment, and a look of pure, childlike joy transformed his tired face. It was a fleeting glimpse of humanity, stripped of uniforms and allegiances. Word quickly spread through the camp. The prisoners who had received the treats were animated, discussing the strange, sweet drink and the cold, delicious cream. Their faces, usually grim or resigned, held a spark of something new: curiosity, wonder, and a touch of gratitude. They had experienced something entirely outside their wartime existence, something that spoke of a world beyond the grim realities of battle and imprisonment. Eleanor observed it all, a quiet satisfaction settling within her. She saw the amazement, the momentary forgetting of their circumstances. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was a small one. It was a moment where the wall between captor and captured, between enemy and foe, thinned just enough for a shared human experience to shine through. Later, Captain Miller, having heard whispers of the Red Cross treats, confronted Eleanor. "Sergeant Vance, I hear you've been distributing refreshments to our guests. What exactly was that about?" His tone was sharp, accusing. Eleanor stood her ground. "Sir, Major Thompson authorized a humanitarian distribution of surplus supplies, properly logged and documented, to alleviate heat-related stress among the labor detail. It falls within the purview of maintaining prisoner welfare, as per regulations." She presented him with the signed requisition from Major Thompson, leaving him with no bureaucratic avenue for complaint. Miller snatched the document, his face a thundercloud. He couldn't fault the paperwork, but he could fault the spirit. "You're too soft, Vance, too sentimental. These are the enemy! They deserve nothing but what's required by law. You understand?" "I understand my duty, Captain," Eleanor replied, her voice unwavering. "And my duty includes adhering to the standards of conduct that define us as Americans, even in war." She walked away, leaving Miller fuming. The ice cream and Coca-Cola were more than just treats. They were a quiet act of defiance, a statement of her belief in dignity and humanity, even for those on the other side. And in the amazed faces of the German prisoners, Eleanor saw not just enemies, but men, briefly touched by an unexpected kindness, a small comfort in a world defined by hardship. It was a stark contrast to the bitterness she often faced from her own colleagues, and it fueled her quiet resolve even further. This small act had unexpected consequences, consequences she could not yet foresee, but which would ripple through the camp and beyond. The incident with the Coca-Cola and ice cream had an unexpected ripple effect throughout the Fort Riley POW camp. While Captain Miller continued to grumble about Eleanor's softness, the German prisoners themselves spoke of it in hushed, amazed tones. The news spread, translated through the camp's informal grapevine, about the cold, sweet drink and the creamy wonder given by the stern but fair female sergeant. It wasn't just the taste, it was the gesture. In their war-torn world, where every crumb was accounted for, this unexpected generosity was a shock, a glimpse into an American abundance they could scarcely comprehend. For Eleanor, the immediate aftermath brought a renewed, albeit subtle, shift in her perception among the prisoners. Before, she was simply another American authority figure, perhaps a curiosity as a woman in uniform. Now, there was a flicker of something new in their eyes when they saw her, not exactly gratitude, but a recognition, a certain respect that transcended the animosity of war. They still stood at attention, still followed orders, but their demeanor towards her held a fraction less resentment, a touch more compliance. This made her job logistically a little easier, proving to her that humane treatment wasn't weakness, but a strategic advantage. However, among her American colleagues, the divide sharpened. Captain Miller grew more openly hostile. He viewed Eleanor's actions as an insult to his authority and a dangerous precedent. Lieutenant Barnes, emboldened by Miller's stance, began to actively undermine her, spreading rumors that she was too sympathetic to the enemy, or even worse, that she was trying to curry favor with them. "Heard Sergeant Vance is practically friends with the Jerrys now?" Barnes sneered one day in the mess hall, loud enough for several soldiers to hear. "Next thing you know, she'll be inviting them for tea and crumpets." Eleanor, who was eating alone at a small table, felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge him. But the whispers and knowing glances stung. It was more than just professional frustration now. It felt personal, a deliberate chipping away at her character. Her unwavering commitment to duty, which she believed was her shield, was now being twisted against her. One particularly difficult morning, a sensitive inventory of medical supplies went missing. These weren't just common bandages. They were specialized antibiotics and surgical tools, crucial for the health of both American personnel and POWs. The camp was thrown into a frenzy. A full-scale investigation was launched. Captain Miller, predictably, zeroed in on Eleanor. "Sergeant Vance, as the head of logistics, this falls squarely on your shoulders. How could such a critical shipment simply vanish?" His voice was laced with an almost triumphant accusation. "Perhaps your attention has been diverted elsewhere?" The implication was clear. Her softness had led to sloppiness or worse, deliberate negligence. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle over her. She knew she had meticulously logged and secured that shipment herself. She double-checked the locks, verified the inventory. "Sir, I personally oversaw the storage of those supplies. Every entry was correct, every lock secured. This isn't a lapse in procedure." "Then where are they, Sergeant?" Miller thundered, slamming his fist on his desk. "Are you suggesting they walked off on their own? Or perhaps you simply aren't as capable as you believe yourself to be?" The injustice of it burned. She knew he was using this as an opportunity to discredit her, to prove his long-held belief that women were unfit for positions of real responsibility. She spent grueling hours day and night, retracing every step of the supply chain, poring over manifests, interviewing guards, and checking every storage locker. Her superiors, under Miller's influence, seemed to eye her with growing suspicion, their faith in her dwindling. She was ostracized, largely left to her own devices in her desperate search. During her investigation, Eleanor found herself having to interact more frequently with the German POWs, particularly those assigned to work details near the supply depots. She needed to ask if they had seen anything unusual, any unauthorized movement. She used a translator, an older, quieter German prisoner named Heinrich, who had a reputation for being observant and taciturn. As she questioned the prisoners, she noticed a subtle change in their responses. Instead of the usual evasiveness or stoic silence, some seemed more willing to engage, albeit cautiously. When she asked about the missing supplies, she noticed a distinct reluctance to meet her gaze when certain guards were mentioned. She pressed gently, professionally, always through Heinrich, explaining the seriousness of the missing items. One evening, after another fruitless day of searching, Eleanor was walking back to her quarters, feeling utterly defeated. She saw Heinrich, the translator, discreetly waiting for her near the edge of the barracks. He looked nervous, glancing around. "Sergeant Vance," he said in heavily accented English, I need to speak about the missing supplies." Eleanor stopped, her heart quickening. "Yes, Heinrich. What is it?" He lowered his voice further. "Not all Americans are good. Not all follow rules." He hesitated, then continued. "The items, medical supplies, they are not lost. They are traded for favors by some guards." Eleanor felt a jolt of shock, then a surge of anger. Traded with whom? And for what? Heinrich looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Small things, tobacco, extra rations. Sometimes for information about family back home, from letters." He looked around again, his anxiety palpable. "They are selling the medicines to other prisoners who have money or things to trade." "Who, Heinrich?" "Who is doing this?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with controlled fury. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Lieutenant Barnes and his men. They take from the stores when the night watch changes. They know the routine." Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her. Barnes, the same man who consistently mocked her, who undermined her. It made a horrifying kind of sense. He'd been so quick to accuse her of incompetence, knowing full well his own culpability. "Why are you telling me this, Heinrich?" she asked, genuinely curious. She knew the risk he was taking. He looked directly at her, his eyes serious. You gave us the cold drink. The sweet cream. No one else has done such a thing. You treat us fair. Even when others do not. You are not like them. He nodded towards the direction of the officer's mess. You deserve the truth. And this is wrong. It is against all rules. Eleanor felt a powerful mix of emotions, validation, relief, and a fierce determination. She finally had a lead, and it had come from the most unexpected source, a German prisoner, an enemy, who had chosen to trust her because of a small act of kindness. The Coca-Cola and ice cream weren't just treats. They were a bridge built across a chasm of war, a testament to her belief in humanity. She thanked Heinrich, assuring him his confidence would be protected. She knew she couldn't go straight to Captain Miller with this. Miller would dismiss it as the word of an enemy prisoner, a desperate attempt to shift blame, especially against his favored Lieutenant Barnes. He would likely use it to further condemn her. She needed irrefutable proof. The next few nights, Eleanor covertly observed the supply depot. She planned her movements meticulously, using her knowledge of the camp's routines and blind spots. She documented everything: the times, the specific guards involved, the clandestine exchanges. It was dangerous, risky work, placing her in direct opposition to her own command, but her sense of justice, deeply bruised by the constant injustice she faced, propelled her forward. One night, she hid herself near the depot, obscured by a stack of crates, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as Lieutenant Barnes himself, under the cover of darkness, met with 2 other guards. She saw them unlock the supply tent, heard the clinking of bottles, the rustling of packages. She saw them exchange items with a few German POWs who had managed to slip away from their barracks, not for escape, but for trade. She saw small amounts of medication changing hands, tobacco and what looked like a smuggled uniform insignia being exchanged in return. She took careful notes, making mental images of every detail. This wasn't just a few missing supplies. This was a black market operation, compromising camp security and prisoner welfare, led by an American officer. As she crept back to her quarters that night, adrenaline coursing through her veins, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. The insults, the mockery, the unjust accusations, they had fueled her resolve. Now, armed with concrete evidence, she knew she was on the cusp of something significant. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing corruption, ensuring justice, and upholding the integrity of the uniform she wore, an integrity that certain men in her command seemed to have forgotten. The ripple effect of a simple act of kindness was about to turn into a wave of truth. Eleanor spent the next few days meticulously organizing her evidence. She wrote detailed reports recalling every observation from her nights of clandestine surveillance. She listed the dates, times, specific individuals involved, and the nature of the contraband. She even managed to sketch rough diagrams of the exchange points, adding further weight to her claims. She knew that her word alone, especially as a woman often undermined by her superiors, would not be enough. She needed a mountain of facts, unassailable and undeniable. Her plan was to bypass Captain Miller entirely. Going to him would be akin to walking into a trap. He would either dismiss her, bury her report, or worse, retaliate against her. Eleanor decided to go straight to the Provost Marshal, the head of military police, a Colonel Davis, a man known for his stern adherence to regulations and his intolerance for corruption. It was a risky move, an act that could either vindicate her or lead to her own court-martial for insubordination and making false accusations against an officer. The day she requested an audience with Colonel Davis, a palpable tension hung in the air. Word had spread that Eleanor was still relentlessly pursuing the missing medical supplies, and her unusual request to see the Provost Marshal raised eyebrows. Captain Miller, upon hearing of it, scoffed. She's probably going to complain about the heat again, or try to get more treats for her German friends. He underestimated her, as always. Eleanor walked into Colonel Davis's office with a calm exterior that belied the tremor in her hands. Colonel Davis was a formidable man with a stern gaze and a reputation for being unyielding. He gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant Vance," he began, his voice gravelly. Captain Miller tells me you've been quite agitated about these missing supplies. And now you're here. State your business. Eleanor took a deep breath. Sir, I'm here to report a systemic breach of security and a pattern of corruption involving Lieutenant Barnes and several other guards in the POW camp. I have compiled evidence of their involvement in a black market operation, trading government supplies, including critical medical items, for contraband with German prisoners. Colonel Davis's eyebrows shot up. His face, previously stoic, now held a flicker of surprise, then intense focus. Corruption, Sergeant? These are serious allegations. Do you have proof, or is this merely speculation? I have proof, sir, Eleanor replied, her voice gaining strength as she laid out her meticulously prepared report and accompanying notes. She systematically went through her findings, the covert observations, the specific names, the detailed accounts of the exchanges. She recounted Heinrich's testimony, carefully omitting his name, but explaining that her initial lead came from a reliable source within the prisoner population, concerned about the breaches of security. She made it clear that her source's safety was paramount. As she spoke, Colonel Davis listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a sharp question, probing for inconsistencies. Eleanor answered each query with precision and confidence, her knowledge of the camp's operations and regulations undeniable. She explained how Barnes and his men exploited the shift changes, how they used certain prisoners as intermediaries, and how they created false logs to cover their tracks. She even produced a small, carefully preserved piece of paper, a crude manifest she had found discarded near the depot, detailing some of the illegal trades, evidently dropped by one of the guards in a hurry. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Colonel Davis leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. He looked at Eleanor with a new intensity, an almost assessing gaze that she hadn't seen from any male superior before. It wasn't dismissive. It was evaluative. Sergeant Vance, he said slowly, if what you say is true, this is a severe breach of military conduct and a direct threat to the integrity of this camp. And you pursued this alone? Yes, sir, Eleanor confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. My initial reports to Captain Miller regarding the missing supplies were not given due consideration. I felt it imperative to investigate independently. She didn't dwell on Miller's disdain, simply stated the facts. Colonel Davis picked up the crude manifest, examining it closely. This is compelling, Sergeant. Very compelling. And extremely dangerous work you've done. You put yourself at considerable risk. He then pressed a button on his intercom. Sergeant Major, please have Captain Miller and Lieutenant Barnes report to my office immediately. And bring a detachment of military police with you. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her, quickly followed by a surge of nervous energy. The moment of truth had arrived. When Captain Miller and Lieutenant Barnes arrived, they looked bewildered, then apprehensive, upon seeing Eleanor seated calmly in Colonel Davis's office. Miller's face flushed with anger when he saw her. Sergeant Vance, what is the meaning of this? Have you been wasting the Colonel's time with your petty grievances? Colonel Davis cut him off, his voice like steel. Captain Miller, Lieutenant Barnes, these are not petty grievances. Sergeant Vance has presented compelling evidence of a black market operation being run in this camp, involving government property, and it implicates Lieutenant Barnes directly, along with other personnel. Sergeant Vance, please repeat your findings for Captain Miller and Lieutenant Barnes. Eleanor, her voice steady and clear, recited her report once more. As she spoke, Miller's face drained of color, his initial anger replaced by shock and dawning horror. Barnes, initially defiant, slowly wilted under the weight of her detailed accusations and Colonel Davis's unwavering gaze. When she produced the discarded manifest, Barnes's eyes darted nervously, betraying his guilt. The military police entered the office, standing at attention, their presence a stark, undeniable symbol of the gravity of the situation. Lieutenant Barnes, Colonel Davis stated, his voice devoid of emotion, you are hereby relieved of duty, pending a full investigation and court-martial proceedings. You and your accomplices will be escorted to the brig. Captain Miller, I will require a full report from you on how this operation was allowed to flourish under your command, and I expect it to be thorough. Miller, looking utterly defeated, could only stammer a reply. He glanced at Eleanor, his expression a mixture of disbelief, resentment, and a grudging, unspoken acknowledgement of her power. The woman he had so consistently underestimated, mocked, and dismissed had just exposed the corruption under his nose, a corruption that could tarnish his own career irrevocably. As Barnes and his men were led away by the MPs, the silence in the office was deafening. Colonel Davis turned back to Eleanor. "Sergeant Vance," he said, a hint of something akin to admiration in his voice, "you have acted with extraordinary courage and integrity. You have upheld the highest standards of military conduct, often under very difficult circumstances, and you have uncovered a serious threat to the security and morale of this camp." Eleanor simply stood at attention, her gaze unwavering. She hadn't sought praise. She had sought justice. The truth was out. The corruption was exposed. But for Eleanor, the journey wasn't quite over. The initial rush of vindication would soon give way to the complex aftermath, and the true meaning of her strength and sacrifice would become even clearer. The twist wasn't just in the exposure of truth, but in the profound shift it would bring to her own standing and to the respect she had so fiercely earned. The aftermath of Barnes's exposure sent shockwaves through Fort Riley. A full-scale internal investigation followed, confirming Eleanor's findings. Lieutenant Barnes and his implicated guards were court-martialed, found guilty of corruption, theft of government property, and endangering camp security. The news spread quickly, not just through the military base, but into the local civilian community, painting a grim picture of wartime opportunism. Captain Miller, though not directly implicated in the black market operation, faced severe reprimand for his negligence and failure to supervise his command effectively. His career, once seemingly secure, was now irrevocably marred. He was transferred to a remote administrative post, far from the daily operations of POW camps, effectively ending his active command. The sight of him packing his office, his once booming voice reduced to a quiet mumble, was a stark image of poetic justice for Eleanor. For Eleanor herself, the change was profound. Her name, once whispered with skepticism or disdain, was now spoken with a newfound respect. Colonel Davis, true to his word, lauded her actions in official reports. Commending her exceptional diligence, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice, suddenly her orders were followed without question. The lingering snickers and dismissive glances from other male officers vanished, replaced by nods of acknowledgement, even admiration. The wall of prejudice that had surrounded her for so long began to crumble. But it wasn't just professional vindication. The true depth of her impact was revealed in smaller, more personal moments. One afternoon, as she walked past a group of German POWs on a work detail, she noticed their usual stoic expressions softening slightly. One of them, a young man who had been particularly amazed by the ice cream, gave her a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that transcended language and nationality. It was a gesture of respect, earned not through force, but through fairness and the quiet upholding of principles. Later, she received an unexpected communication. It was a letter, carefully vetted and translated, from Heinrich, the German prisoner who had bravely given her the crucial lead. He was being transferred to another camp, but before he left, he had requested to send a message. The letter was short, written in careful German script, then translated. It read, "Sergeant Vance, my family back home, they are suffering. But your actions here, they show that even in war there is honor. Thank you for your justice, and thank you for the cold drink. It gave us hope." Eleanor read the letter in the solitude of her barrack room, a lump forming in her throat. The cold drink, such a simple gesture, yet it had meant so much. It had built a bridge, earned trust, and ultimately helped expose a deeply rooted corruption. Her quiet act of defiance had not only cleared her name, but had also affirmed her belief that treating even one's enemies with dignity was not weakness, but a powerful form of strength. Her strength was not in physical prowess or a loud voice, but in her unwavering integrity, her meticulous attention to detail, and her refusal to be broken by injustice. She had faced down prejudice, betrayal, and ridicule, and she had emerged victorious not through aggression, but through quiet perseverance and an unshakable moral compass, One day, Colonel Davis called her into his office. He looked at her with a knowing smile. "Sergeant Vance," he said, "I've been reviewing your service record. Your dedication and capabilities are exemplary, and frankly, we need more officers like you, regardless of anything else." He paused, then continued. "I'm recommending you for a battlefield commission. It won't be easy, you'll have to prove yourself again, but I have no doubt you'll succeed." Eleanor was stunned. A battlefield commission. It was an honor rarely bestowed, even more so upon a woman. It meant moving beyond the rank of sergeant, becoming a commissioned officer, a lieutenant. It was a recognition not just of her recent actions, but of her entire journey, her relentless fight against the odds. It was the ultimate vindication. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion, a rare crack in her composed facade. "I won't let you down." The story of Sergeant Eleanor Vance became a quiet legend at Fort Riley. It wasn't about heroics on a distant battlefield, but about a different kind of bravery, the courage to stand up for what was right in the face of prejudice and corruption, right there on the home front. It was a story of a woman underestimated, mocked, and challenged who, through her sheer force of character and unwavering commitment to justice, earned the respect she deserved not just from her superiors, but from the very men she was tasked to guard. Eleanor's journey continued, and she did indeed earn her commission, going on to serve with distinction. She continued to carry the lessons learned at Fort Riley. That kindness could be a weapon. That integrity was the most powerful shield, and that true strength lay in one's character, not in the uniform or the expectations of others. The war would eventually end, and the German prisoners would return to a broken homeland, forever carrying the memory of the strange, sweet comforts of America, the Coca-Cola and ice cream, and the unexpected fairness of a brave female sergeant named Eleanor Vance. And back home, Eleanor would remember the long, dusty days, the insults, the injustice, and the quiet triumph of proving them all wrong. One meticulous report and one unexpected act of kindness at a time. Her path to justice and redemption wasn't a sudden, explosive event, but a steady, unyielding march, proving that even in the chaos of war, true character always shines through. It was a testament to the power of one individual to change perceptions and ultimately to redefine what it meant to serve. Tools.